When you're juggling aperture, shutter, and ISO, it's called equivalent exposure. Understand it so you can keep those three balls in the air and get the exposure and the creative outcome you want. Next year on Slanted Lens. Let's talk about the balancing act that's called equivalent exposure. Every scene has a certain amount of light in it, and we have to make a decision. Do we assign that light to the shutter, or do we assign that light to the aperture? So that's about exposure. How do we get a correct exposure? That's using the exposure triangle. In the exposure triangle, we have three things that we're working with. The very first one is aperture. The aperture controls what's in focus, how much depth of field there is. So if you take a picture of this cactus, look at this cactus, I've got a really shallow depth of field at 2.8, or a really deep depth of field at f22. That changes, the aperture changes the amount of depth of field in the scene. So what does the shutter do? The shutter creates motion or stops motion. Because the shutter is moving and it's about time, the amount of time it's opened, it can be open for a short time or a long time. Because of that movement, it creates or stops motion. So something at a half a second, like water, is going to blur, whereas 3 seconds is going to really blur. Versus if you go to 4,000th of a second, that's going to stop sports action, where two soccer players are up in the air hitting the ball. At 4,000th of a second, that 4,000th of a second is going to stop that motion. So what does ISO do? ISO is how sensitive your camera's sensor is to light. 100 ISO means that it's not very sensitive, so it needs a lot more light. 6400 ISO means it's much more sensitive, so it doesn't need as much light. But the problem is you get noise with sensors. When you get a 6400, it's going to be very noisy and grainy and cause a problem. So there's the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter. That's our exposure triangle. So now, what is a normal exposure? And a normal exposure is when the image has correct highlights and correct shadows. You know, highlights aren't too bright, the shadows aren't too dark. Look at this example of what a normal exposure is. Normal exposure is what we're going for. So when we find a normal exposure, here we have it at 1/15th of a second at f22. That's a normal exposure. So let's talk about equivalent exposure. First off, I'm going to use my exposure wheel. What this is on the outside I have my shutter speeds, on the inside I have my apertures. So the first one, I've got a shutter speed at 1/15th of a second. So all the way over here at 1/15th of a second is my shutter. And I've got f22. So I'm going to f16. So I'm going to put f16 at 1/15th of a second. What this does now is it means that every single other one of these are correct exposures. 11 at the 30th, 8 at 60th, 5 at 125th, 4 at 250th, 2.8 at 500, and 2 at 1000th. So right now how I've got my camera set up here is that I've got at 16, deep depth of field, f16, and 1/15th of a second. The shutter's dragging. So that means the motion of my scene is going to blur, but I'm going to have deep depth of field. This gives us the ability to make a decision about motion on the outside and depth of field on the inside. I can have a lot of depth of field or very shallow depth of field. That's called equivalent exposure. So there's a look at equivalent exposure using an exposure wheel. We have a copy of this in our member area you can download. Check that out. It's a great thing to have in your bag just to carry with you. But now let's go back to some examples using our example right here. First off, my first image is a woman, it's a portrait, and what do I want in this portrait? I want a very shallow depth of field. So my concern is not about stopping motion because she's not moving very fast, but my concern is just simply to get rid of the depth of field. I want very little depth of field. So I'm going to go from f16 and I'm going to dump all of this over to my shutter, and I'll probably shoot at about 2.8 at 1/500th of a second. Now I've got a shallow depth of field behind her, beautiful bokeh behind there. I'm using a longer lens, it makes that really nice, but there's my exposure. The next is a shot I did of Jodie Sweetin from Fuller House. In this scene, we've got a kitchen out of control and crazy in the background. I want to see what's going on back there. I want to be able to see the sink and the fire and everything. So I don't want a shallow depth of field. I need a little more depth of field. I'm going to move this all the way up to probably about f8. That's going to give me a nice look at that background, and yet not give me too much depth of field, but enough to be able to see everything in the background to give me a nice image. And so now my shutter goes to a 60th of a second, which is absolutely fine because there's not a lot of motion there. There's a little motion in the water out of the sink, but not enough to create a huge issue in that 60th of a second. It's going to let that blur a little bit and look nice. So the next shot we have here is a sports shot. Now, I've got a problem. I need to be fast, fast, fast shutter. So I go all the way over here. If I go all the way over to what would be, I don't have enough exposure here. So I've got to go to ISO. I'm now going to take my ISO. I'm going to go up to 4 thousandths of a second. 1, 2, 4 thousandths of a second. And I'm going to have to add another, at least one stop, 2.8. So I'm going to push my ISO up to 3200 at least to be able to give myself a fast shutter to freeze the action and to give myself a 2.8 so I have just enough depth of field. I don't want too much depth of field because I want the people behind those soccer players to fall way out of focus. That's going to be my exposure setting. So I had to go to the ISO bucket to be able to make that happen. So now as we move from that sports shot where we want 3200 ISO and we want a fast shutter and we want a really shallow depth of field, we go to a great waterfall shot by Shane Walls. We actually have a download shot by Shane Walls. You can get over our store at online courses. Go to theslanted.com, online courses. You can check out that download in the online courses there. Anyway, Shane likes to shoot with long shutters to blur the water, blur the trees. So this is not gonna work. We're gonna probably move some of this over here. Give us like, because of the stuff in the foreground, 5.6, maybe f8. But we've got to get rid of all of this exposure. Remember, we were at 3200 or ISO. We're going to dial our ISO back down. We're going to dial it back down to 100 ISO, which will get us all the way down to 1/8 of a second. That's on the bottom of the scale. 1/8 of a second at about f5.6. That's going to give us that beautiful waterfall with that blurring water. So now it's time to apply this information that we've learned to this image here in the background with Jeremiah. Let's get him in here and let's shoot some shallow depth of field, deep depth of field, motion, stop motion. Let's do those 4 combinations next. Let's get to it. Let's take a look at some other examples of images that were shot and what the camera settings were. That concludes our 3-part series on shutter, aperture, and equivalent exposure. I hope you gained a deeper understanding of the exposure triangle, and now when you get asked questions on what camera settings, you can think about what you want to accomplish, and that will help you decide what your camera settings need to be. It gives you the power to know. That's the question I get asked more than anything else is, what should my camera settings be? Well, understanding the exposure triangle, understanding shutter and what it does, aperture and what it does, and equivalent exposure and what it does, allows you to decide what camera settings you need for a particular image. So make sure you subscribe here to the Slanted Lands. Ring that bell if you want to hear when we have other information just like this. Make sure you leave a comment below because we want to hear what you think of the things we just talked about. And keep those cameras rolling. Keep on clicking.